Start in chapter 10 and verse 20. We didn't get there yet. And in my daily Bible read, I have a podcast that I've subscribed to where it just automatically, uploads whatever the Bible read for the day is, and you just listen to it. And this morning on the way here, it was Ecclesiastes 1 through 3, and then some other things. And one of the fascinating things that showed up is some of the things that he talked about in chapter 1 at the very beginning, he hits very hard in chapter 11 and chapter 12 very hard. One of the things in chapter 1 that he said he was searching for was to seek by wisdom and discover wisdom. And what's fascinating about chapter 10 is in chapter 10, he's contrasting wisdom and folly in the whole thing. These are conclusions. He's explaining it after he's done all of his searching. Another thing that's fascinating to me is in chapter 10, there is no specific mention of God in chapter 10. Is that interesting to anybody else? That's pretty interesting to me because we've gotten to the shift in chapter 9 where at the beginning in chapter 9 verse 1 he says that their deeds are in the hand of God. In other words, you can't separate life under the sun from God because life under the sun is in the hand of God. And then he says in verse 7, God has approved of your works in chapter 9. But in all of chapter 10, there's no specific mention of God. Which is fascinating. So even in life under the sun, even though we know God is in the picture at this point, but wisdom has been beneficial. Wisdom has been good. He's been contrasting wisdom and folly in just very everyday life situations. And then in chapter 11, we're going to see God at least 2 times. Yeah, God is specifically mentioned 2 times in chapter 11, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 times in chapter 12. So God definitely permeates this section. But it's interesting to me that chapter 10, he's not explicitly mentioned once. Really fascinating. Okay, any thoughts or anything before we get into chapter 10 and verse 20?
Why do you think that is?
Do what?
Why do you think that is?
I think this is very under the sun, everyday, real life, brass tacks Proverbs. That's typically what I think. And especially
Shit right before the end where it's like God exploded.
I think God is in the picture here just because chapter 9, has God in the picture. But I do think it's very much like he has been exploring and searching for wisdom. And he says, this is wise, even under the sun. And so there's these wisdom proverbs for everyday life. And if you remember from last week, these are very brass tacks things. Like the fools are bad with money. They make poor occupational choices. They are bad leaders. It's things like that, very worldly things. But then definitely extend out beyond that. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. Well, let's look at chapter 10, verse 20. Chapter 10, verse 20. This is the only one that we didn't get to last week. So in verse 20, it says, furthermore, in your bedchamber, do not curse a king. And in your sleeping rooms, do not curse a rich man. For a bird of the heavens will carry the sound, and the winged creature will make the matter known. This is so funny to me. It's so funny. You ever heard the little birdie told me? You ever heard that? And a lot of times we have these phrases and we don't know where they came from. It comes from right here. I mean, this is thousands of years old, and that's where that little saying comes from. A little birdie told me that such and such thing happened, or so and so is doing this thing. That's exactly what's being talked about here. But the wisdom that's being revealed here is don't curse a king, even in your bedchamber. In your sleeping rooms, don't curse a rich man, because the matter is going to come out some way or the other. In other words, your words really matter. The words that we speak about people in authority, specifically is who's mentioned here as people in authority, or a rich man, somebody who might have privileges that other people might not have. He says that don't even speak these bad things against them, even in your bedroom, even in your bedchamber, because you never know who's listening. You never know how that might reach the ears of that person, and then you're going to look really silly. And all of us have probably done this, right? We've experienced something where maybe we said something, and maybe, let's assume the best, and even it was taken out of context. Maybe you weren't really saying something mean about somebody, but somebody heard a little snippet of it, and that little snippet that they heard out of context sounds bad, gets to the ears of that person, and then you're like, oh no, I really didn't mean that. Oh no, that's not all I was talking about. But somebody, somehow, some way, they hear about it, and the matter will be made known. And so the wisdom is, be careful about what you say. Your words really do matter. Okay, any thoughts on any of that in verse 20? Yes, sir.
I think it's just as much, not even what you said, what you did. That's like almost where the world get karma or, manifest things to happen. And I just don't even think on it. All those expressions, like, yeah, this is so fascinating that people are going through that same struggles and issues and challenges that we feel today.
Mhm.
It's amazing.
Yeah, thousands of years ago, people are still people. It's comforting to me anyway, because I've definitely been the person with my foot in my mouth after saying something dumb. Yeah, anybody else? Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, one of the things I just wanted to bring up, we go, even if there's people, this happens. And so it shouldn't surprise us that it happens in local congregations. And it's interesting you mentioned even our thoughts, because our nonverbal communication sometimes speaks louder than our verbal communication. The way that we think affects the way that we act, even if we are not always aware of it. So say that brother so-and-so really gets on my nerves, and I'm not even thinking about it, but I shook everybody's hand today. I didn't shake his hand. I don't know. By the way, I'm not thinking of anybody, so don't don't think I'm talking about. I'm not shaking anybody's hand today, by the way. My kids are sick, so there's that too. But our nonverbals sometimes speak a lot louder than our verbals. And here, he's just saying the matter is going to be known. And so any of these things, another way that people take this, because specifically authority, people in authority are being talked about, is Big Brother's always watching. It's not 1984 at this point, but Big Brother's always watching. You never know who's listening. You never know how it's going to reach the ears of these people in authority. But man, it can really do a lot of hurt, not just to you and your reputation, but to theirs. Gossip and murmuring that gets spread around. If there's no evidence or witnesses of those things, but the gossip and the murmuring starts spreading around, you can tear down a person's entire life completely falsely. And that's a rough business to be in, and our words really do matter. Okay, any last thoughts on verse 20 or anything in chapter 10 before we go on to chapter 11? Okay. Well, here in chapter 10, just for a mini review of chapter 10, is that wisdom is good and folly is bad. It seems like the most simple statement that you could make, but that's something that Solomon has explored. He has searched since the very beginning of this book. And here he gives us some very everyday proverbs for this. And another thing is, you're not too young to have wisdom, and you're never too old to get more wisdom, is something that we're going to see that comes into chapter 11 and chapter 12. Folly can be true no matter how old you are, and wisdom can be true no matter how old you are. And in chapter 11, anyway, we're going to see that there are going to be some specific instructions to younger people on how to be wise when they're young. In chapter 12, there's going to be instructions to younger people how they can be wise when they're young. And then as people age, I believe there's still going to be instructions for gaining wisdom or retaining wisdom in chapter 12. Okay, anything else before we get into chapter 11? All right. Well, in chapter 11, verse 1, I will tell you, this is, I've been telling Caitlin about this all week. This is one of my least favorite passages in this entire book, because it's a very difficult phrase to understand. But let's read verses 1 through 6, because I think there's at least 3 plausible explanations that end up giving us the same interpretation no matter which direction we go. So let's read the first 6 verses together, please, and then we'll break it down. So chapter 11, cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days. Divide your portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. If the clouds are full, they pour out rain upon the earth. And whether a tree falls toward the south or toward the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. Just as you don't know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you don't know the activity of God, who makes all things. Sow your seed in the morning. Do not be idle in the evening, for you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. So here in these first 6 verses, I've got it up here that this is financial wisdom. And I think for me, this is going to make the most sense. Financial wisdom. One of the things that I think I do, and you tell me if you relate to this, is I read verses 1 and 2, and I don't think about what's being said. I think about what I've heard the interpretation is. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that if the interpretation is right. But for me, for my brain, again, maybe you don't relate to this, but I've got to figure out, what did this mean to them? What's the very literal picture that's being used here to figuratively be talked about something else, and then draw those chains. So I think we're very good, if you're like me, this is what it says, this is what it means. But what got us to, what does this mean? Because I'll tell you, when I read cast your bread on the surface of the waters, I think about feeding ducks. I'm thinking about breaking up some bread and tossing it to the ducks. And there's no way you're going to get a return. You're not going to find that bread again after you feed it to the ducks. And that water will get in that bread and it'll sink, or some other thing will get it. And there's no way that's what's being talked about here, right? One of the things that's interesting about this phrase in verse 1, cast your bread on the surface of the waters, there is no direct modern parallel for this phrase. I think the closest thing is don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's probably the closest thing. But for what this what this imagery is, there's no direct modern parallel, so it's very difficult to interpret. And again, I think there's a few things that at least make sense. Number one of the interpretations that people have given historically for this is that Solomon is talking about international commerce. I don't know, has anybody ever heard this one about international commerce? Okay, so Solomon has all these ships from Tarshish that imported and exported all of his goods. We talked about that in the very first lesson about the historical context and Solomon. And so maybe he's saying, okay, ship out your goods, your bread, your wheat. By the way, the word for bread there could mean wheat. It could mean grain. It could mean just food in general. And so what he's saying is, okay, let's ship all this stuff out and you're going to get a return on that investment over time. And maybe that's what he's talking about, because verse 2, he says, divide it to 7 or even to 8, because you don't know what misfortune may occur on the earth. So maybe he's saying, don't just send one ship out in your commerce that has everything that you're hoping to sell, because if there's a bad storm and overtakes that, you lose everything. But he says, okay, split it up to 7 or even 8 different ships and different commerce and things like that. And if bad stuff happens to a few of them, you might still get a return on those that didn't have that misfortune happen to them. So that's one way that people take this. Metaphor, very agricultural. And one of the reasons for that is in verse 3 and 4 and even 6, how many things are very agricultural here. So in verse 4, talking about somebody who's watching the wind, but they won't sow. They won't sow their seed, or they're looking at the clouds and they don't reap. That's very agricultural language. Verse 6, sow your seed in the morning. Don't be idle in the evening. You don't know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. And so some people use all these verses in the same context to say this has to be very agricultural. So then what are we talking about? Casting your bread on the surface of the waters. And so we have to understand some of the agricultural methods of the day if this interpretation is true. So there was usually a dry season and a rainy season in that time and place. And so if you sow your seed during the dry period, that ground is hard as a rock. You're not going to have anything grow at that point. And so what you do is you wait till the rainy season when the ground is a little bit softer, and you plow the field, which was basically like a stick with you have your ox or whatever it is, and you're forcing that ground to break up after it's rained a little bit. And after you break it up in the rainy season, you get these sort of puddles that show up where you've been plowing. Okay, so then you cast your seed in those puddles on that water that you've just made and you've just plowed out. And so then it could be you're going to get a return for that bread, that grain that you've cast out onto those waters. Because if you do it on the hard ground, it doesn't make any sense. And another way that is used in this agricultural metaphor is with wheat grain. You can choose to eat it right now. That can be food. It's a resource. You can eat it right now. Or you can go sell it and get some money and buy something else that you need, or get something else that you need. Or you can cast it on the waters. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort. But then if that grows up, you're going to have a lot more than you cast out. And so you get a return on your investment. And so maybe that's what the whole divide it to 7 or 8. You don't know what misfortune may occur on the earth. So in all of that, it's a pretty difficult thing here, but I think in either one of those, we're getting something that Solomon has been doing in all of Ecclesiastes leading up to this point. If he's talking about either one of these, is he actually talking about financial or even agricultural things? I don't think so. I think he's using that as a metaphor for something else. So he's saying, cast it in a bunch of different directions. You don't know where you're going to get your return. If it's going to be here, if it's going to be there. You don't know what misfortune is going to occur in this area and not in that area. And so cast it out there and you will get a return for it. And so what we usually say, the interpretation of this, which I think is a very good interpretation, is be generous. Cast your resources to those who need it in different areas and in places that you don't even know what's going to happen. That's what happens in verse 2 and verse 3 and verse 4 and verse 5. You don't know what's going to happen, so spread it out in a bunch of different directions. And so be generous with people, and who knows, if some misfortune comes to you, usually if you're a generous person, people want to be generous back to you. Okay, are there any thoughts? I'm going to do a lot of talking here. Any thoughts on this whole section? We're going to go more into it, but any thoughts? Yes, sir.
I think of it as what you just mentioned there is the doing good to others, basically. Share with others, good to others. Clearly, that's a biblical principle. Maybe not New Testament principle. And maybe the motivation is not that I'm good, so I'll get good, but that is a result, often a result of doing good. And we all have a time, everybody. And if people never help anybody else, they're likely to get help from others. I mean, it's not going to be as great. So I just kind of thought about that.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or anything on this section? Maybe specifically verse 1. It's a pretty difficult metaphor to understand. Okay. Well, just continuing on all of this, like in verse 2, divide your portion to 7 or even to 8. You don't know what misfortune may occur on the earth. So being very generous, if it's the financial wisdom of diversifying your resources because you might get a return on it, not necessarily in being generous that you're going to get a return on it. I do think the key for the generosity understanding is the end of verse 5. The end of verse 5. Well, actually, just all of verse 5. Just as you don't know the path of the wind, how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you don't know the activity of God who makes all things. So this is with God in the picture. This is not just life under the sun. You've got to sow and toil and do all these things, but God is in the picture. And so divide your portion out, because when God's in the picture, there will be a return, but that doesn't mean it's going to come back to you, but there will be a return no matter what. In verse 3, if the clouds are full, they pour out rain, whether a tree falls toward the south or toward the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. I really like that, because if just in nature and things happen in nature, and that's just the way that it is. If a tree falls, if it falls to the north, okay, that's where it fell. If it falls to the south, okay, that's where it fell. And so the wisdom here is be generous, cast it out. You don't know the working of God, who's going to make there be a return when he is in the picture. And in verse 4, I think we see analysis paralysis. That's my favorite phrase to say with verse 4, because he says, if you're just watching the wind and looking for the perfect conditions before you sow your seed, he says, you're not going to sow. And he says, if you're looking at the clouds for the perfect time to reap your harvest, you're never going to find the perfect conditions. It's get to work now, sort of invest in your life now, invest in other people, cast your resources out now, because you don't know what's going to happen. And that's exactly what he says in verse 5. You don't know what will happen. So invest in other people, in your life, cast out these resources to 7 to even 8, because if God's in the picture, God will make sure that there is a return. That doesn't mean that you necessarily will get a return, but there will be a return. I think that's really important. And so in verse 6, he says, so go out there and do it. Do the work. Go sow the seed in the morning. Go sow the seed in the evening. You don't know which one will succeed. One of them might not. The other one might. But both of them might not. In this verse, it says both of them alike might be good. You don't know. And so cast that stuff out. Spread your resources out. Invest in your life. Invest in people. And with God in the picture, there will be a return. Any thoughts on any of this whole section here? Yes, sir.
And I think that's kind of the point. It isn't really any one particular issue. It's not talking about what makes the best financial sense. It's not what's saying, what's the best way to do it. It's not saying, I think it's all of it. This idea of diversifying is important in the financial investment world, but it's also important in education. Someone who focuses in on one particular degree, this is the only thing I want to learn. If that doesn't work out for them, they don't have a fallback. It's the idea of getting a broad-based education. It's the idea of doing good in a variety of different ways and different areas. It's developing multiple skills that'll serve you in life. I think all of those things are encompassed in this idea, because what Solomon is really saying is, you don't know how God is gonna cause this to work out for good.
Mm.
But what you need to do is just do good in a variety of different ways and trust God to work that out.
Mhm. Yeah, that was very well said. You should be teaching this class instead of me. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my thoughts are really similarly in line with Charlie and but especially reading verse 4, he observes the wind will not sow. My grandfather, towards the end of his life, got really into alternative medicine. He was so fixated on like what was the best way and healthiest way to stay alive. And the irony was that consumed him so much he forgot to live his life. He became this almost hermit of just like research and formulas and figuring out what the best way to quote stay alive was while neglecting his life, right? And I think that to me that's so applicable. Like the term navel gazing, if you're familiar with that, you become so fixed. I think the origin is actually very spiritual in nature, where you would like stare at something so specific to find like spiritual relevance or spiritual like transcendence. But it's this idea that you're so fixated on one particular thing to the detriment of everything else going on around you, right? And I get that way very much so with God and my spiritual life. I think of how many Christians I know that are in their 60s, 70s plus, who have been in church their entire life and are waiting for the wind to blow the right way for them to sow their seed. They're too afraid to go out and share this gospel that they've been absorbing for 60, 70 years. And that's so easy of a trap to fall into, where you become so fixated on making sure that the conditions are just perfect. The chapter heading in mind is the value of diligence. That you can be diligent. You forget to do what it is that you've spent your life working towards. And that's just such a huge miss. And to me, that's what I'm really taking from this passage a little bit. I know there's a lot of application, but for me, that's what's hitting me the hardest this moment.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Do good and spread it out to others. And one of the things that I meant to mention, and you just said that and made me think of it, is in whatever the direct literal meaning of this phrase is, that we get the interpretation, which I think is right, about being generous and sharing, whichever one it is. Notice that neither one of those happen like that. It is about ships and commerce. There's a lot of work that goes into that. If it's shipbuilding, if it's loading up the supplies, if it's actually going on the journey and doing all these things, that's a whole process. If it's the agricultural interpretation, where you've got to wait till the rainy season, you've got to plow the field, you've got to sow the stuff, you got to get the weeds out, get the tares out, all that stuff, that's a whole process. It's not I get the return right away. It is diligence. It is continual casting. It's continual work. And it's not something that just happens right away, but there is a return for the diligence. And that's because God's in the picture. Yes, sir.
Exactly what you said at the very end. I think something between 5 and 6 is saying, what's going to happen is going to happen, number one. But number two, for you to use that as a crutch as opposed to springboard is taking God out of the equation. Like, it's going to happen, but like verse 5, don't forget that God's in it all regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. And this also connects with, I can't remember if we talked about it last week or the week before that, about how time and chance overtakes them all. Here in verse 5, it doesn't say that God is not active. It says he is, but you don't know the activity of God in all these things. He makes all things, you don't know the activity of God. So very much in all of our endeavors, God needs to be in the picture in our minds when we make decisions, when we decide to do good things and cast out good things, generous things. But it's also very much, who knows? Maybe God did that. Who knows? Who knows? And that's very much like Esther, which we talked about a couple weeks ago as well. So our decisions, the things that we sow, the things that we cast, the directions that we go in our lives need to have God in our minds, because God is going to be active and we need to have God in our minds as well. And so I think about, our decisions aren't ruled solely by, well, this job pays this certain amount, so I'm going to move to such and such place and do blah, 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 blah. God needs to come into the picture, which is, okay, what is going to be best for me to serve my God? And for, I don't know if you want to have kids, where my kids are going to grow up to serve God, where all of these different things. God needs to be in the equation because he's already in it, whether we acknowledge it or not. But the decisions that we make in casting out and being generous and doing good and being diligent, God is going to give a return, and so he needs to be in our minds as well. Okay, any thoughts on any of that? Yes, sir.
Reminded me of what Bill was talking about. I would solve this with evangelism. In the congregation where I grew up, there was one man in the congregation who was very on fire for evangelism, which was great. But he thought there was one particular study course that was in his mind, the most effective and therefore the only way that you should do evangelism. But whatever reason, I don't even think that course is even published, used by anybody today. And that's kind of the point. I think Solomon is trying to tell us that we don't know what is quote unquote the best way. There really isn't one best way for anything. So do good things in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, definitely the idea of diversify, especially if this is directly, literally a financial allegory, but the meaning isn't financial. It's diversify in investing in people and in life and in doing good things and being generous because God's in the picture. Yes, sir.
I think he's saying that if you can't figure out how to get from here to the, I think that's verse 5. So you don't know how the bones are knit together. You don't know the beginning. You can kind of see it in, but you don't know how to get there. So don't try to figure it all out. Just get involved.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Dan just said, you don't know. You might know what you want the end to be or what the end's going to be, but you don't know how to get from beginning to end. The middle can be very messy to get there. And so just trust God and get involved. Do the work because God is involved. Is that right? What you said? Okay. And I really appreciate that too, because I think if we went around the room and talked about our personal life stories, maybe when you were 18, you had an image for your life and exactly what was going to happen in your life. I'm going to do this job for 40 years, and then I'm going to retire, whatever it is. How many of you followed that plan? Probably not very many of us. I know for sure I haven't. And I hope that in those different things, and hopefully today, if anybody is still switching and making changes, whatever it is, that God's in the picture and that we make those decisions based on God being in the picture and not just on our own wisdom or on our own understanding, but with God in the picture, because God is involved, whether we like it or not. And it will go a lot better for us if we involve God in our own decision-making process along the way. Okay, anything else before we move on here?
But he says there has to be wisdom involved, because sow the seed in the water, you can't sow the seed.
Yeah.
So we have to make wise decisions, then turn the rest to God.
Yeah, make wise decisions and then leave the rest to God. Yeah, I really like that. Okay, anything else? Yes, sir.
Do you think this is connected to the previous chapter?
Because
in chapter 10, he focuses quite a bit on the folly of fools and how they propagate that folly. And so he talks about the fools in verse 12. He says, the words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, but the lips of a fool consumes them. The beginning of the words of his mouth is folly. The end of his speaking is evil madness. Yet the fool multiplies words. The fool is scattering his words out wherever, whenever. However, the wise person in chapter 11 is casting his wisdom, finance, or whatever it is out on the waters where it can be profitable. And so, it almost seems like a shift to just do chapter 10 and chapter 11 apart from each other. Because then if we only take chapter 11 in terms of financial wisdom, I know you've got that kind of in quotes up there, in the fiscal sense of just do good and spread your money out so that it does the most good, then it's difficult to connect it to the previous chapter. So can it focus then, and I think others have touched on this, but can it focus on wisdom being the thing that is cast out? Wisdom being the thing that is spread out on the waters. And then you don't know how God is going to use that to affect the hearts of men or to affect events or all of those things. And, I really think about, not to keep going, but the end of chapter 10, when we talked about don't curse the king even in your thoughts, don't curse a rich person in your bedroom. For a bird of the sky may carry the message, and a winged creature may report the matter. So the words of the fool are going out, and they're gonna come back on him and do harm. The words of the wise in chapter 11 are going to go out, but they're gonna be beneficial. So maybe we're talking about more than just physical things. Maybe we're talking about wisdom, we're talking about knowledge of God, we're talking about whatever it is.
Yeah, so I kid you not, the very next question that I have written down here is, why this subject matter at this point? And we've been in chapter 10 contrasting wisdom with folly. And like you said, it's really more focused on folly in chapter 10. It says wisdom is good, and the section that you brought out in verse 12, words of the wise man are gracious. That's a very short, pithy statement. And then the rest is talking about the foolishness of fools. And one of the reasons why I think this, right after chapter 10, these chapter breaks weren't originally there, is if you look at verse, let's see, 18 and 19, we were talking about how the fools are lazy and things go wrong for them because they're lazy because of their foolishness. And so here I think we get a contrast. We don't see the word folly here, I don't remember here in verses 1 through 6, but the contrast between the lazy man, the insolent man, indolent, what am I looking for here? Yeah, indolence. There we go. The laziness and the foolishness that he brings on himself brings about things not to go well for him, and it's his own fault. But you contrast that in chapter 11 with the wise man who is scattering by the way, financial wisdom. It might be a financial image, but it's still wisdom. And so, yeah, I think you're exactly right. That it is a continuation, but it's no longer focusing on the folly of fools, but this is what it looks like, the wisdom of the wise in their everyday living. Okay, any other thoughts or anything? All right. Well, let's keep going here. Let's go and let's read verses 7 and 8. 7 and 8. It says, the light is pleasant, and it is good for the eyes to see the sun. Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all. Let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything that is to come will be futility. So here in these verses, I really appreciate this very much. This is right after a section about you don't know what will happen. You don't know how it's going to happen. So just do good. Trust God that things are going to go and they're going to end the way that they're supposed to end. Do good. Do these things with God in the picture. And so in verse 7 and 8, we really see enjoy life. You don't know what will happen, so enjoy your life. The light is pleasant and it's good for the eyes to see the sun. We've seen throughout this whole book, life under the sun has been described as grievous, as evil, as toilsome, as burdensome. I mean, the words go on and on and on. Just about your toiling and your labor, which amounts to nothing, essentially is what Solomon says, has been just awful. And it's not worth it. It's vanity. It's futility. But look at this difference. We've seen these little pictures of this difference. But here in verse 7, the light is pleasant. It's good for the eyes to see the sun. With God in the picture, it's good to enjoy your life. It's good to be under the sun. Soak in those rays. And so Solomon is saying, don't waste it. Enjoy your life. In verse 8, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all. And he says, let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many, and everything that is to come will be futility. Now there in verse 8, where it says the days of darkness, I've seen two different interpretations of that. One of them is, I think, more natural, the more natural reading, which is just, there's going to be good days and there's going to be bad days. So enjoy the good ones because there's going to be bad ones, and everything that is going to come to futility. Another way that people take this is that days of darkness is near the end of your life when maybe life is painful and more difficult with a degenerating body. That's another way that people take that, which would follow very well with chapter 12, by the way. But just here in what we're looking at, it seems to me that maybe it's talking about enjoy it. Even if you live a long time, rejoice in your days, rejoice in your life, because there's going to be days of darkness. There are going to be many. Bad things are going to happen, and everything that is will come to futility there. Okay, any thoughts on 7 and 8? It's a nice bright spot in Ecclesiastes, I think. Nice bright spot. One of the things I want to mention here is go back to chapter 6 quickly here. And in chapter 6, I think we see the exact opposite of what Solomon is talking about here. Here, God is in the picture and you can enjoy your life, even if you live super old and maybe things are difficult for you, which we get into chapter 12. He says you can still enjoy it. You can still enjoy your life. But in chapter 6, look at verse 3. Verse 3. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, however many they be, but his soul is not satisfied with good things, and he does not even have a proper burial, then I say, better the miscarriage than he. For it comes in futility, goes into obscurity, and its name is covered in obscurity. It never sees the sun, and it never knows anything. It is better off than he. Even if the other man lives 1,000 years twice and does not enjoy good things, do not all go to one place. So do we see the contrast between this and over in chapter 11? In chapter 6, here's this guy who has every reason to enjoy his life and to be thankful for what he has. But in verse 3, his soul is not satisfied with them. He's always wanting more. God's not in the picture at this point, and it's just not good. In verse 5, after saying that the miscarriage is better off than this ungrateful or greedy or wanting more man, he says that miscarriage never sees the sun and never knows anything. And it's better that way than to see the grievous life under the sun. But then contrast that in chapter 11 with the light is pleasant and it's good for the eyes to see the sun. That's pretty different, isn't it? It's good to have been born. It's good to experience life under the sun when God's in the picture. Completely changes everything. Okay, any thoughts on any of that? All right. Nice bright spot again. I really appreciate it. We've seen little glimpses of this all along the way, and this is just another one of those. But here at the end with conclusions. Okay, let's look down at verses 9 and 10, please. 9 and 10. Here he says, rejoice, young man, during your childhood. Let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So remove grief and anger from your heart, and put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. They're fleeting. So here the preacher encourages younger people to enjoy themselves because he says the prime of life is fleeting. Does anybody have in the end of verse 10, does it say something different than the prime of life are fleeting? Vanity. Ah, isn't that fascinating? Yes, thank you very much. We've talked about this all throughout this whole book. That word has multiple different meanings and senses of what it is. It's the exact same word. It's vanity. So here, though, it doesn't mean useless or empty or lacking substance. It just means it goes by fast. It's fleeting. It goes by quickly. And so Solomon's wisdom here is enjoy it. Live life while you can. Do these things while you can. And there are several things we can talk about here. It doesn't seem like it when you're young, but older people, this is a quote from my grandfather, by the way, older people are just young people in old bodies. And I love that. And I really appreciate it. And by the way, I'm sorry, I'm a younger guy teaching this class, especially when we get to chapter 12. I'm sorry for the things that are going to come out of my mouth. But here, younger people are told to enjoy their lives. Let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood. We'll talk a little bit more about the second half of verse 9. Somebody have a hand up over? Yes, sir.
Not to change anything, maybe for every day, but it's just so staggering to me. Someone had asked me just this last week if Jewish people or the Old Testament, if they believe in heaven. And I said, from what I've gathered, my background of being around a lot in New York, I'm a rabbi, teach 2 classes I had in school, and them being asked, they really didn't have, or don't to this day, have a concept of obey God for salvation. And even reading the verse that we just did in 6, but about the baby, it'd be better to not be born. You know, you would expect that was written by a Christian, or in the New Testament, it would be, you know, it'd be better to be saved God afterwards, or, and in all this, it's do the right thing, or no matter what you feel in this world, you're going to have salvation, you're going to have redemption. There's none of that in this. This is like live for the moment, and your reward is here, and it's not because your soul's going to be saved. And it's really, it's just fascinating to me that every word of yours here because God wanted to keep, right? But yet he didn't give them at this point in time so many of the perspective that we have today of why to do the right thing. So they know to do the right thing. I think this is all about do the right thing, spread, be wise, be efficient, but not because of why we would do it to please God. So when they have hope with him in heaven, it's to live your life and enjoy it. It's so gloomy to me. But it really shows the evidence to say that it's better for a baby to not have been born because it would know nothing is so wrong. In my mind, it'd be better for a baby not to go through the stuff and possibly lose his soul, right? Because he didn't do well or lived a life of terrible decisions to experience heaven and salvation. There's just no concept of salvation for doing the right thing. That's what I see.
Yeah, well, to that, I think there's a couple of things. One is that whole section about the miscarriage. I think that is a exaggeration to say, look at the oppression in very physical things. Look at the oppression in life under the sun. And he's saying it'd be better to be a miscarriage and never see these acts of oppression under the sun rather than talking about eternal salvation. But one of the things that I think you're very right, and we do this as well, is we say, oh, one day things are going to be great. One day when I die and go to heaven, then things will be great. And there's so much in the scriptures about because God is in your life, you can enjoy your life right now. You can live your life to the fullest within the confines of God and enjoy your life. We don't have to be miserable. I can't think of the word right now. The guys who really abuse their own body to emphasize the spiritual. You don't got to do that. You can enjoy your life. He says, eat, drink, be merry, enjoy life with the woman of your youth, all the days of your life, all those things. And right here in verse 9, just to continue because we're running out of time, he says, follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Do you know anybody who would stand up at the pulpit and say, young people, go follow your impulses and the desires of your eyes? Probably nobody. Not just that, because we have to include the second part. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So it very much is, with God in the picture, within the confines of a God-filled life, go for it. There's no shame or fear in that. With God in your life, you can follow those things. You can go do the things that are good and right as long as God is in the picture. Very much live in the moment, live your life. And I really appreciate that. And verse 10 emphasizes it. He says, remove grief, remove anger from your heart, put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. Life is far too short for us to hold on to grudges, to grief, to anger against people. It's just too short. Our life is not worth holding on to those things that are just so negative and can pull us down. Within the confines of a God-filled life, we can drop those things and enjoy our lives, even if you're a younger person. And man, that feels great, doesn't it? Especially in Ecclesiastes, where so many things are useless. With God in the picture, go for it. Enjoy your life. And really, I think that comparing all of this to chapter 2 and chapter 3, where Solomon tries everything unrestrained. You remember that? He tried everything. He tried with alcohol. He tried with women. He tried with works and building things and all the things that he tried. And he said, it's not fulfilling. It doesn't last. It doesn't mean anything to just live unrestrained. So the contrast here is with God in the picture, in a restrained life by what God has, you can actually live a fulfilling life right now. And it will be fulfilling. You can go after the impulses and desires of your heart within the confines of God, and it will be fulfilling. And wow, how comforting and amazing is that for us? We don't just have to wait for one day, although it will be amazing one day. But right now, you can enjoy your life. And by the way, whether you're young or old, but specifically here, it's talking about younger people. Okay, anything else on these verses here? Yes, sir.
That read, people are referred to read some of this, but one was Psalm 16:11, and the point is that in God's presence is fullness of joy. That, and then another big one where you use 1 Timothy 4:8. We're talking Timothy, but it's talking about exercise being a benefit. But Paul tells Timothy, God is profitable in this life. Well, that's a lot. Shut that out. You're going to suffer so much. But there's goodness in this life. It's profitable for it.
Yeah.
Better off in this life.
Absolutely. Godliness is not only profitable forever, but in this life. Yeah. All right, chapter 12 next week, and it'll be the last class.